Welcome back. You're watching the Jacksonville History Show. I'm Harry Reagan. Our guest is Dr. Wayne Wood. Welcome, Wayne.
Harry, good to be here again.
And we're talking about the anniversary of the Subtropical Exposition, actually the visit of Grover Cleveland, President Cleveland, to Jacksonville. Set the stage for us. We're talking about what year?
Well, it's appropriate in a way that we talked about Lindbergh's visit, because that was one of the great big events in Jacksonville history, akin to the Super Bowl. And the Subtropical Exposition was the Super Bowl of its time. It was started in 1887, completed in 1888, and opened on January the 12th, 1880. And the story of why the Subtropical Exposition got built and what happened there is kind of a fascinating one I'd like to speak about.
Okay, let's take a look at the pictures.
First of all, after the Civil War, as most of you know, Jacksonville became quite a tourist mecca. The Yankee troops who occupied Jacksonville during the war went home and told their friends about this city that had beautiful climate in wintertime, beautiful scenery with the majestic St. Johns River and the ocean. And so by 1869, Jacksonville was a full-fledged destination, perhaps the greatest mecca for tourists on the eastern seaboard.
And it was hard, if not impossible, to go to South Florida.
It was hardly there at that time. And so even though Jacksonville was not much of a metropolis to sneeze at, it was the biggest city in Florida. And as the tourists made their way, not in this particular wagon, but along the streets of Bay Street, you found curio shops and photographers taking pictures. And as the tourists rolled in on the many boats, steamships that came down the river, large hotels were built to accommodate these northern visitors, and the population would double in size during the winter months, during the peak of the tourist season. Here's the old Grand National Hotel, later became the Everett, and the Nichols House, a very prominent three-story hotel with great verandas, and the Carlton House down on Bay Street. And perhaps the grandest of them all was the St. James Hotel, which was known throughout the country as one of the grand hotels of the South. Now, the St. James was opulent both inside and outside. Here you see the grand dining room.
Wow.
And you could see in the guest register of the St. James the signatures of the Astors and the Vanderbilts and the kings and princesses of Europe all stayed at the St. James. And so as the tourists poured in, Jacksonville's economy became largely tourist-based. And here's a shot sitting on the veranda of the Windsor Hotel overlooking what is today Hemming Plaza with the St. James Hotel in the background. Now, in the tourist season of 1885, they had the largest number of tourists ever, over 30,000 tourists in one 4-month season. And in the next year, they had an even larger tourist season. But about this time, California began to advertise its destination as a tourist mecca, and so by 1886, the tourist industry was beginning to decline. Not to mention this man, Henry Flagler, who had other ideas about Florida south of Jacksonville and built the opulent Ponce de Leon Hotel and several other big hotels along the East Coast, taking away Jacksonville's thunder as the tourist destination. So Jacksonville was threatened also by the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which allowed people to go to San Francisco, which built many beautiful hotels. And then Southern California built its great tourist hotels. And so by 1886, there was a true threat to Jacksonville's tourist economy. Turn now to this man named Charles Jones. He was the editor of the Times-Union, and he later went on to work with Joseph Pulitzer at several prominent national newspapers. But Jones read an editorial called "Let's Thump California," proposing that we build a grand exposition here, akin to many of the other great World's Fairs that had just taken place. In fact, the big granddaddy of all the international expositions was the London Exposition. And this brought into being the idea that you could bring in a lot of tourists, not to mention make a lot of money by having a grand exposition. And so throughout the United States, many cities had expositions that were quite successful. And having grand exhibition space as well as selling and showing the wares of the locality, these were quite popular with people throughout the United States. So this man, who's J.J. Daniel, he was the president of the Florida Publishing Company and also the head of the Board of Trade, which later became the Chamber of Commerce. And so he put to work Charles Jones' idea to build an exposition, and they called it the Subtropical Exposition. The date on the building was 1887, although it did not get completed until January the 12th, 1888. And this grand building was designed by the architectural firm of McClure and Ellis, two of the prominent architects of the time. And although it was very stately and grand in appearance, it was made of wood and stuccoed over to have the look of stone, built as a short-term temporary building.
And where is this?
This was located on Main Street at Hogan's Creek, near where Waterworks Park is today, right across from Confederate Park. And this grand edifice was completed in about 6 months, and it was attraction not just for locals, but many people came from all over the state of Florida as well as the United States to see the Subtropical Exposition.
So it was a success.
It was a success.
Yeah.
It opened on January the 12th and closed on April the 15th of that year, and went on to have 4 more seasons, and we'll talk in a minute about the demise of the Subtropical Exposition. But it was quite an exciting event for people in Jacksonville, because here was several of these exotic buildings on the grounds with exhibits and displays of wares from all over the state of Florida. But also there was a lake with an alligator in it, and there was a tribe of Seminole Indians camped on the site and their little chickees. And so it was quite a elaborate affair and took up many, many acres. The Subtropical Exposition building itself was about the size of a football field.
You'd love to be able to go back and see it, wouldn't you?
I would love to see that building. What a grand Xanadu-like towering building it was. And so tourists would come and go through all the buildings and take part of this grand affair. The interior was lit with wonderful windows that brought natural light in, and all the different exhibits from around the state of Florida. Each county pretty much had their own little exhibit space to come and show the products and the features of their part of the state. So Jacksonville shared this exposition with other parts of the state, and the goal was not just to bring in tourists, but to help develop the state of Florida, which was one of J.J. Daniels' main goals in doing this. And you can see the extent of the exhibits. And it was actually a big ramshackle giant barn on the inside, but served the purpose well. These are very rare old photographs. We've started discovering these old photographs on eBay. Most of the pictures taken in Jacksonville during the tourist era cannot be found in local antique shops, but are instead taken home by northern visitors whose great-great-grandchildren sell them on eBay, and they come back to Jacksonville.
And none of that exists today. It's all gone?
Not one stick of the Subtropical Exposition still exists, but at the time it did exist, it was on Main Street, then called Pine Street, and the Pine Street trolley took locals and tourists from the hotels downtown out to the Subtropical Exposition. And here you can see the chimney of the Waterworks building on the site that is still the Waterworks site today. Now, the fair opened on January the 12th. By February the 22nd, an even bigger event happened, and that's when the President of the United States decided to come to Jacksonville to take in this World's Fair. And so the city put up grand arches over the streets, and this was one of the biggest, most exciting events to ever occur in the city of Jacksonville.
First time a president had ever come to Jacksonville?
I believe it was. And President Grover Cleveland came on this day, and you see these arches over Main Street with the picture of President Grover Cleveland at the top. President Grover Cleveland was the second fattest president that ever lived. I don't know if that's an important part for our history, but he was a colorful character, and he was famously known for his young bride, who he had been the law partner of her father, and when the father died, he became the curator of her estate. And when she was in her very early 20s, she was married to this large presidential man in the White House when she was in barely 20 years old. And she was the talk of the town with her fancy clothes and style-setting fashions. Everybody wanted to get to see the president's wife as much as the president himself. And so the parade from the railroad station to the St. James Hotel attracted everyone in the city of Jacksonville. And interestingly, the grand staircase for the St. James Hotel nearly collapsed because of the crowd of people who were gathered on it to see the president and his child bride.
Including an overweight president.
Including the overweight president. And so it made the tour of the exposition and came back actually again a year later to see it. But it was the one moment in Jacksonville's history where all the stars were aligned. Now here you see a picture of the Subtropical Exposition several years later. It closed after 4 years and went into decline, and gradually by 1897 it was demolished. And part of the reason it lacked success was at the end of the first season in 1888 there was a terrible yellow fever epidemic. Yellow fever similar to malaria,
right.
And people suddenly stayed away from Jacksonville in droves. The city was quarantined. They thought yellow fever was caused by airborne germs, and so they burned fires and shot cannons to kill it. And they even set up refugee camps outside the city to get people out of this city, which they did not know the cause of this disease. But the yellow fever really is what killed the...
took a while to recover from that.
It took several years to recover, and it's what killed the Subtropical Exposition. And Old St. Luke's Hospital, seen here, was one of the heroic institutions that helped take care of the patients and help stem the tide of this horrible, deadly disease.
And we should mention that...
and that is the Jacksonville Historical Society property now, where our archives is located. Right. And nobody ever wants to get yellow fever. It was one of the most gruesome, horrible disease involving horrible things that you don't want to talk about on TV. Mm-hmm. And it was all caused by the mosquito,
right.
Not by any airborne germs, but they didn't know it at the time. So the Subtropical Exposition has faded into history, but certainly one of the grand moments in Jacksonville's history, and a great part of our legacy of not only architecture for this amazing towering building, but also reminding us of Jacksonville's place in the forefront of the Victorian tourist era.
Now, I think cities that did this kind of thing had in mind a longer life for those buildings and some future use after the exposition.
You know, that's actually not true. The grandest of the expositions in the United States was in Chicago in 1872. Was one of the early ones, and then 1892 for the commemoration of Columbus, and they were all temporary buildings.
Oh, okay.
They were built with plaster and wood frames, and they were destined to be torn down after the fair, and in fact many of them burned during the fair because they were so unsubstantially built.
So a lot of cities did this, and there's nothing left of them today.
Pretty much they're gone. The great Chicago Exposition has one building left. It's now the Chicago Institute of Art. Mm-hmm. And the building in Jacksonville, after it was the Subtropical Exposition, went on to become a zoo and an auditorium and probably a flea market at the time.
Mm-hmm. And this was a really big and successful effort to
the first 2 years were quite successful, and it died off after that, as did Jacksonville's tourist industry, which gave way to the bigger and fancier hotels in South Florida and in California.
And Flagler was part of that, also building a railroad to...
He built railroads not to Jacksonville, but through Jacksonville.
Through Jacksonville, yeah. And
to get to his big hotel.
I guess most people were, tourists were coming here by water, primarily.
Well, from right after the Civil War, the big sailing ships and steamships came to Jacksonville. The Clyde Line had a number of ships that came here, and there were schooners. If you went out on the riverfront in Jacksonville in the 1870s, you might see over 100 ships going up and down the St. Johns River, paddle wheelers, schooners, steamers. It was quite an interesting vista in those days. Well,
Dr. Wayne Wood, thank you for being with us on the Jacksonville History Show. Fascinating subject.
Well, happy 125th anniversary of the Subtropical Exposition.
Right, and I hope you will come back again soon.
Thank you, Harry.
And that's our show. You can find more out about Jacksonville history by going to our website, jackshistory.com, or by calling 665-0064. Until next time, we're history.